There is a man in feudal Japan who wakes before sunrise every single morning, not because someone forces him to, not because a notification buzzes on his wrist, but because he decided, once, a long time ago, who he was going to be. He does not negotiate with himself at 5 in the morning. He does not scroll through his phone to find the motivation to get out of bed. He is already up. You already know what you want. You can feel it the moment someone asks you about your goals. The words come fast, the vision is clear, the energy in your voice changes. You want to build something, finish something, become someone you have not yet managed to become on a consistent basis. But here is the problem. Nobody talks about loudly enough. Wanting it has never been the issue. You have read the books, you have watched the videos, you have started the project 17 times and restarted it 18. And every single time you get going, something happens. Not a catastrophe, not a tragedy, just Tuesday. Just ordinary life arriving on schedule to interrupt the version of yourself you almost became. There is a term in psychology called the intention-action gap, the documented, measurable, clinically observed space between knowing what you should do and actually doing it. Researchers at the Decision Lab describe it as what occurs when your values, attitudes, or intentions do not match your actions. This gap has nothing to do with intelligence, nothing to do with character, and nothing to do with how badly you want something. It has everything to do with architecture. Most driven people do not have a discipline problem. They have a system problem. They are trying to build a skyscraper on a foundation designed for a weekend tent. The samurai did not rely on inspiration to train every day. And in the next few minutes, you are going to understand exactly why that matters for your life in 2026. Set the scene, feudal Japan. Picture Japan in the 1600s, in the long silence between wars. The samurai class has existed for centuries, but something peculiar is happening during this period of relative peace. Without a battlefield to define them, the samurai begin to codify something that warriors had always practiced informally, a complete philosophy of daily life that would later be written down and called Bushido, literally, the way of the warrior. This was not a motivational poster. This was not a morning routine hack from a podcast. This was a decision-making architecture, built specifically for the moment when you do not feel like doing the thing you know you need to do. And it worked so reliably for so long across so many generations that it laid the cultural groundwork for the single most powerful productivity philosophy in modern history. Bushido was not a collection of inspirational virtues. Every historian who has studied it closely arrives at the same conclusion. It functioned as a pre-made decision system. The site ironmotion.com, dedicated to samurai philosophy and practical application, states it plainly. When a man has a clearly defined standard, a code to which he committed before the moment of pressure arrived, he does not need to make a decision. In the moment, the decision was already made. Read that again, because that is the entire game. Every morning, you wake up undisciplined is a morning where the decision was left open. Every day you failed to execute on what mattered was a day you allowed the negotiation to happen in real time, when your willpower was low, when the comfort of inaction was available, when your brain was running on yesterday's exhaustion and looking for the path of least resistance. The samurai had a training practice called kata, a precisely choreographed sequence of movements practiced until every element became automatic. Western people tend to think of kata as a physical exercise, a kind of elaborate dance of techniques. But that interpretation misses the entire point. Kata was a mind training method disguised as a body training method. Every repetition of a kata was not just training the movement, it was training the quality of attention the movement required, the focus, the presence, the non-negotiable commitment to standard. When a samurai had performed a sequence 10,000 times, the movement no longer required a decision. It required only the showing up. And showing up, just showing up, is 90% of what separates the person who builds something from the person who only talks about building something. The samurai's daily practice was comprehensive in a way that most modern productivity systems pretend to be but rarely achieve. According to historical records analyzed by pathofftheswordsage.com, the samurai practiced morning reflection on intentions and potential challenges, evening review of actions taken and lessons learned, continuous study of strategy, philosophy, and practical skills, and physical training to maintain discipline and readiness. Notice what that list does not include: inspiration. There is no item on the samurai's daily agenda called "wait until you feel motivated." Motivation was irrelevant to the practice. Self-control, or jisei in Japanese, was considered one of the central virtues of Bushido, not because self-control felt good, but because it was the only reliable engine for consistent action. The samurai believed, and the evidence of history agrees with them, that a man who requires a good mood to function is a man who cannot be counted on. 300 years after the samurai were codifying Bushido in their dojos, a different group of Japanese thinkers, working in manufacturing plants in post-World War II Japan, arrived at a remarkably similar conclusion through an entirely different door. They called their discovery Kaizen. The word is a compound of two characters, kai, meaning change or revision, and zen, meaning virtue or goodness. Together, change for the better. But Kaizen was not about grand transformation. It was about the smallest possible improvement, made every single day, compounding over time into results that looked like miracles to everyone who had not been watching the process. Masaki Imai, considered the father of Kaizen in the Western world, introduced the philosophy globally through his 1986 book and later through the Kaizen Institute. His core principle, which every serious student of the method eventually memorizes, was this: do not seek perfection, seek continual improvement. Perfection, Imai argued, will be achieved by the repetition of small daily improvements. The difference is not semantic, it is architectural. Perfection is a destination you can never reach. Daily improvement is a direction you can always walk in. The most famous proof of Kaizen's power is Toyota. In the decades following World War II, Toyota implemented the creative idea suggestion system and built Kaizen into the cultural DNA of every level of the company, from the CEO to the assembly line worker. The result was not a single dramatic breakthrough. There was no one invention, no one genius moment, no revolutionary product launch that explained Toyota's rise to become the world's largest automaker. There were thousands of tiny improvements, made consistently by ordinary people who had internalized the practice. The Lean Enterprise Institute notes that Taiichi Ono, the architect of the Toyota production system, once said, "There can be no Kaizen without a standard." That phrase sounds simple. It is not. It means that before you can improve anything, you must first define what you are actually doing. You must have a baseline, a committed practice, a kata. The samurai knew this. The Toyota engineers rediscovered it. And you will need to understand it before any of this applies to your actual life. The Kaizen Institute's own research into personal application of the philosophy makes the connection explicit. The same principles that transform organizations can be applied to personal life, helping to build positive habits, improve focus, and achieve goals in a sustainable way. The key to getting started is identifying a habit or area of improvement that, while seemingly small, delivers an immediate positive impact. Because these adjustments free up energy for priority tasks and create a cumulative effect. Here is what that looks like in practice. You do not decide to write a book. You decide to write 200 words every morning before you open your email. You do not decide to get fit. You decide to do 10 minutes of movement before your first coffee. You do not decide to become disciplined. You decide on one standard that you will hold without negotiation for the next 30 days. And you make the standard so small that missing it feels embarrassing. This is not weakness. This is neuroscience. The basal ganglia is a structure deep inside the human brain responsible for something extraordinary. It converts repeated conscious decisions into automatic behavior. When you first learn a new skill, your prefrontal cortex is running the show. The thinking part of the brain is working hard, consuming energy, requiring focus. But as you repeat the behavior, control begins to transfer. The basal ganglia takes over. The prefrontal cortex is freed up. Neuroscientists at the University of Western Ontario describe this process clearly. As the task is repeated, the basal ganglia takes over, allowing us to perform the action almost automatically. This shift from conscious effort to unconscious behavior is what makes habits so powerful. But it also explains why starting is so hard. The brain does not commit to automatic behaviors cheaply. It needs evidence, repeated, consistent, reliable evidence, that this behavior is going to keep happening. That is why the samurai trained every single day, without exception. Not because they were obsessed, because they understood intuitively what neuroscience would prove 3 centuries later, that the brain will not invest in automating something you only do when you feel like it. There is a second mechanism worth understanding, and it changes how you think about motivation entirely. When you perform a small positive action, your brain releases dopamine, the neurotransmitter most associated with reward and reinforcement. Research compiled by AHEAD App's behavioral science team reveals something counterintuitive. Micro moments of success create stronger neural pathways than large, occasional wins. This is why the person who completes one small task every day builds momentum more reliably than the person who completes one massive project every 3 months. The brain is not impressed by the size of your effort. The brain is impressed by the frequency and reliability of the signal. Small wins, stacked daily, literally rewire the neural architecture of who you are. Which means Kaizen is not just a management philosophy. It is a biological strategy. Anthony Sani, a productivity expert who has written extensively on the personal application of Kaizen, illustrates the mathematics of the system. Improvements do not have to be large to make a difference, but they do have to be continuous and sustained. Instead of trying to wake up 1 hour earlier overnight, he applied Kaizen by waking up 15 minutes earlier each week for 4 weeks. 4 weeks later, he had achieved the goal. More importantly, he had achieved it in a way the brain could sustain, because the brain was given enough repetitions to build the automatic pathway. The science at CrossFitGreenleaf.com puts a sharper number on it: a 0.01% daily improvement compounds to 4% over a year. 4% does not sound revolutionary, but 4% applied consistently to your writing, your health, your relationships, your skills, 4% of 4% of 4% begins to look indistinguishable from transformation, and it does so without the burnout cycle that destroys 90% of dramatic overhaul attempts. Here is what nobody tells you when they present Kaizen as a productivity tool and Bushido as a historical curiosity. They are not two separate philosophies. They are two expressions of a single Japanese cultural understanding about the relationship between human beings and change. Both emerged from the same soil, a civilization that had been thinking for over 1,000 years about how to make a person more reliably excellent on an ordinary Tuesday, not just on the day of the great battle. The samurai did not separate discipline from identity. The discipline was the identity. Kaizen does not separate improvement from practice. The practice is the improvement. Both systems refuse the Western fantasy that there is a destination called disciplined, that you arrive at one day after a sufficient period of struggle. Both systems insist instead on the same uncomfortable truth. There is only the practice every day without negotiation, and the person you are becoming is constructed entirely from the quality of that practice. The destination is not a place. The destination is who you are while you are walking, and here is where the twist lands with full force, because it is going to feel wrong the first time you hear it. The samurai's rigid, non-negotiable daily code, the thing that looks like the opposite of freedom, was the source of his freedom. When a warrior has already decided every morning what he will do and how he will do it, he does not spend mental energy on that decision. He does not feel the friction of starting. He does not negotiate with the part of his brain that would rather stay comfortable. That decision was made once, in advance, with clear eyes, and it holds. Meanwhile, the driven but undisciplined person, the person who relies on motivation and willpower and inspiration, wakes up every morning facing the same exhausting negotiation. Shall I do the work today? Do I feel like it? Am I in the right headspace? Is this the right moment? That negotiation costs more energy than the work itself, and it is a negotiation you will eventually lose because the opponent, comfort, distraction, resistance, shows up fresh every morning while you show up depleted from the day before. The samurai's system was not a prison. It was a decision he had already won. There is something almost painful about this realization when you sit with it for a moment. Almost every high achiever who burns out, almost every driven person who cycles endlessly between intensity and collapse is making the same structural error. They are treating discipline as something that should emerge from motivation. They believe that if they want the goal badly enough, the discipline will follow. But the samurai tradition and the Kaizen system both insist, with evidence, that it works in reverse. Discipline does not follow motivation. Motivation follows discipline. When you build the practice first, when you show up before you feel ready, when you execute the kata even on the days when nothing inside you wants to, the brain begins to associate the practice with identity, and then identity generates motivation. You do not feel driven because you feel excited. You feel driven because you have evidence, stacked daily, compounded over weeks, that you are someone who does the thing. That evidence is more motivating than any podcast you will ever listen to. The samurai had one more practice that deserves its own moment: Zanshin, translated loosely as remaining mind. Zanshin was the alert, aware state maintained after an action, the practice of not checking out, not collapsing into relief or distraction, but remaining present and accountable to the standard you set for yourself. In practical terms, ironmotion.com describes the modern application as a single daily question, asked at the end of each day. Did I hold the standard today? Yes or no. No middle answer, no context, no explanation. That binary simplicity is not harshness, it is precision. The samurai understood that vague self-assessment is just sophisticated self-deception dressed in the language of nuance. A standard you regularly explain away is not a standard, it is a preference. And preferences bend, standards hold. The difference between a preference and a standard is whether you hold it when holding it costs you something. So, let us return to where we started, to that man in feudal Japan who wakes before sunrise without a negotiation. You understand now that his discipline is not a character trait he was born with. It is not a superpower. It is not something he has that you lack. It is an architecture he built. One decision made in advance. One kata practiced until the brain automated it. One small standard held without exception until the holding of it became easier than the breaking of it. And that architecture has a name. It is the marriage of Bushido and Kaizen, the warrior's code applied at the scale of daily, incremental, compounding improvement. It is what happens when you stop asking, "How do I get motivated?" and start asking, "What is my kata? What is the sequence I will perform without negotiation every day, regardless of how I feel about it?" The samurai's system, applied to your life in 2026, requires 4 decisions made once and never revisited. You do not make these decisions on a Monday morning when you are feeling energized and optimistic. You make them when you are clear and calm and willing to be honest about what you are actually capable of sustaining. Decision 1. Your kata. What is the single daily practice you will perform without negotiation at the same time in the same sequence every day? Not a goal, not an outcome, a practice, a behavior so specific you could describe it to someone else in one sentence. Write 200 words, do 20 push-ups, read 10 pages, make 3 sales calls. The content matters less than the non-negotiability of the standard. Decision 2. Your code. What is the specific unconditional standard that governs your behavior when no one is watching and you do not feel like holding it? This is not a list of values. This is one sentence about who you are when you are alone at 6 in the morning and the path of least resistance is pulling hard. The samurai called this Bushido. You can call it whatever you want, but you need it written down before the moment arrives. Decision 3. Your Kaizen number. What is the smallest version of your kata that counts as a win? 1 push-up counts. 1 paragraph counts. 1 page counts. Masaki Imai built Toyota's dominance on the principle that the direction of improvement matters more than the size of the step. Your Kaizen number exists for the days when everything goes wrong, the days when life arrives on schedule to make your practice feel impossible. On those days, you do not skip. You do the minimum, because the minimum, performed consistently, is infinitely more powerful than the maximum performed occasionally. Decision 4. Your Zanshin question. At the end of every day, you ask one question. Did I hold the standard today? Yes or no. You do not journal about it. You do not explain or contextualize. You answer. If yes, you sleep. If no, you note the breach and you recommit. Not tomorrow, not Monday, not after the current season of life settles down. Tomorrow morning, the next repetition is always the next morning. Here is what those 4 decisions will do to your brain over 66 days. The average time researchers cite for a behavior to reach automaticity. In the first 2 weeks, your prefrontal cortex will fight every single morning. The resistance will feel real. Because it is real, the brain genuinely does not want to invest in building new neural pathways when old pathways are still available. This is normal. This is not failure. This is just neuroscience doing what neuroscience does. In weeks 3 and 4, something will begin to shift. The basal ganglia starts encoding the practice. The resistance gets lighter, not because the work gets easier, but because the decision to begin stops requiring the same expenditure of willpower. The debate starts losing its energy. The practice begins to feel less like a battle and more like a direction. By week 8, the research suggests something remarkable happens, something the samurai described, and the neuroscientists later confirmed. The practice begins to feel incomplete without the ritual. The brain has built the pathway. The dopamine architecture has been installed. You are no longer someone who is trying to be disciplined. You are someone who is disciplined. In the same way, a samurai who has practiced his kata for 10,000 repetitions is no longer someone who is trying to be a warrior. He simply is one. You may be thinking, I have tried systems before. I have built routines and watched them collapse. I have committed to morning practices and evening reviews and 30-day challenges. And here I am, still in the same cycle. Fair. That concern deserves a direct answer. Every system you have tried before had one of two flaws. The standard was too large for the brain to automate, or the practice was conditional on motivation. Kaizen is the antidote to the first flaw. It makes the standard so small that the only reason to skip it is a decision, not an impossibility. Bushido is the antidote to the second. It removes motivation from the equation entirely by treating the practice as identity, not preference. If your previous attempts failed, it was not because you are undisciplined by nature. It was because your architecture had no foundation. There is a phrase from the samurai tradition that does not translate perfectly into English, but deserves its place at the end of this conversation. Nana korobi, yaoki, 7 times down, 8 times up. This was not just a saying about resilience. It was a description of the actual mechanism. The samurai understood that the practice was not about perfection. It was about the returning. Every day that you return to the kata is a day you are not the person who quit. Every morning you hold the standard is a morning you are constructing the architecture of someone who cannot easily be stopped. You already have the drive. That has never been in question. What you are building now is the system that turns that drive into a daily practice that compounds, quietly, without drama, in the direction of the person you already know you are capable of being. The samurai figured this out with a sword and a code. The Toyota engineers figured it out with a manufacturing line and a philosophy. The neuroscientists figured it out with brain scans and dopamine studies. They all arrived at the same conclusion: small, daily, non-negotiable, compounding. That is the Kaizen system. That is the samurai lesson. That is the only productivity truth you will ever actually need, because every other system is a variation of this one, dressed in different language, promising a shortcut that does not exist. There is no shortcut. There is only the kata. If you watch this channel, you already know something most people refuse to believe. The information is not the problem. The architecture is. You see the game. Now go build the system.